The red moons of planet Valdris shone down on the tall mountains like drops of blood in the dark sky. The human ship Prosperity was dying. Smoke poured from holes in its metal sides. Lights flickered on and off inside the ship. The air was getting thin and hard to breathe. Captain Jin stood on the bridge looking out through the big window. The alien planet was getting bigger and bigger as they fell toward it. His hands shook as he checked the ship's systems one more time. Everything was broken. They had maybe 2 hours before the ship would stop working completely. "Sir, the last escape pods are away," said Lieutenant Park. "All the colonists made it to the planet safely. But we have a problem." Jin turned around. "What problem?" "Our flight path is taking us straight into the Forbidden Peaks. That's where the dragons live." Jin felt his stomach drop. The dragons of Valdris were not like the made-up dragons from old Earth stories. These were real. They were huge, bigger than any Earth animal. They were smart, maybe smarter than humans, and they did not like visitors. 3 months ago, the first human ships had tried to land near the dragon territory. The dragons had attacked without warning. They destroyed 2 ships and killed 50 people. After that, the dragons sent a clear message through radio signals. "Stay away from our mountains or die." Down in the ship's nursery, Dr. Hay was holding the last person still on board. Baby Tay was only 6 months old. His parents had died when enemy ships attacked the colony fleet. Now he was alone except for the few humans still on the dying ship. The baby looked up at Dr. Hay with big dark eyes. He did not know that death was coming for all of them. He did not understand that the adults around him were trying to solve an impossible problem. "Status report," Captain Jin said as he walked into the nursery. Commander Wu was there too. His face was grim. "We cannot change our flight path. The engines are dead. We are falling straight toward the Dragon Mountains. What about the emergency thrusters? Not enough power. We might be able to change direction a little bit, but not enough to miss the dragon territory." Dr. Hay rocked the baby gently. "Can we contact the dragons? Try to explain our situation?" "We tried," Wu said. No response. "They probably think we are attacking them." The ship shook hard. More systems were failing. Red warning lights flashed everywhere. Through the walls they could hear the deep calls of dragons echoing from the mountains below. The massive creatures were coming out of their caves. They had seen the falling ship. Captain Jin closed his eyes and thought hard. Every choice led to death. If they crashed in dragon territory, the dragons would kill any survivors. If they tried to land somewhere else, they would crash and burn because the ship was too heavy and broken. Wait. There was one possibility. "The old research files," Jin said suddenly. "From the first contact team. Before the dragons attacked us, what about them?" Dr. Hay asked. "They said something about dragon honor codes. Something about how dragons treat helpless creatures." Commander Wu frowned. "That information is not complete. We only have small pieces of their language translated." "It's all we have," Jin said. He looked at the baby in Dr. Hay's arms. The choice was horrible, but it was the only choice that might save one life. Dr. Hay understood what he was thinking. "No, there has to be another way." "There is no other way," Jin said quietly. "We are all going to die. But maybe, just maybe, the dragons will spare an innocent child." The next hour was the hardest hour of their lives. Dr. Hay prepared a special escape pod for baby Tay. She packed it with everything a baby would need: food, water, blankets, medicine. She also included pictures and videos of humans being kind and peaceful. Maybe the dragons would understand. The pod was made to survive crashing through the atmosphere. It had thick walls and soft padding inside. It would land gently using small rockets to slow it down. "I'm programming it to land near the biggest dragon cave," Dr. Hay said through her tears. "If the dragons have any mercy, they will find him quickly." She kissed the baby's forehead. Tay smiled at her and made happy baby sounds. He thought this was all a game. He did not know his whole species was giving up on him. Captain Jin carried the pod to the launch bay. The other crew members stood in silence. Everyone was crying. They all knew they would never see the child again. "Maybe this is right," said Engineer Kang. "Maybe the dragons will be better parents than we could be." "Don't say that," Dr. Hay whispered. "He belongs with us. With humans. He belongs wherever he can live," Jin said firmly. "And that's not with us. Not today." They put baby Tay in the pod. He looked around with curious eyes. The pod was warm and comfortable. To him, it was just a new place to explore. Jin pressed the launch button. The pod shot out of the ship like a bullet. It fell toward the planet, trailing fire behind it. The red moons lit up its path as it disappeared into the alien sky. On the mountain below, the dragons saw the small object falling toward their home. They did not know that inside was a tiny human baby who would change their world forever. The humans watched until they could not see the pod anymore. Then they prepared for their own crash landing far from the dragons. They knew they were probably going to die, but they had given one small life a chance. Sometimes that was all anyone could do. Baby Tay fell toward his destiny among the ancient dragons of Valdris. His real life was about to begin. Elder Korath felt the tremor through the mountain stone as something struck the ledge outside his ancient lair. The massive dragon, his scales the color of burnished copper and his wingspan broader than a human settlement, emerged from the depths of his cave to investigate. The scent hit him first, alien and warm-blooded, but carrying an undertone of something he had not encountered in 3 centuries of life: vulnerability, complete, absolute helplessness. On the rocky outcropping lay a strange metallic shell cracked open like an egg. Steam rose from its heated surface, and from within came a sound that made Korath's ancient heart pause, a thin crying that spoke of hunger and fear and desperate need. His mate, Valara, landed beside him with a thunderous beating of wings. Her silver scales caught the light of the crimson moons as she extended her great neck to examine the strange arrival. "It is a human hatchling," she said, her mental voice touched with wonder. In their telepathic communication, concepts flowed between them with perfect clarity. Impossible. Humans do not leave their young to die. They guard them jealously, even to their own destruction. Yet here was evidence to the contrary. The tiny creature inside the pod was unmistakably human, with its smooth pink skin, tiny limbs, and that peculiar lack of natural weapons or armor that made their species seem so fragile. Other dragons began to arrive, drawn by curiosity and the unusual sense. Gareth the young, barely 2 centuries old, peered at the baby with golden eyes. Perhaps it was cast out for being defective. "No," Valara said firmly. "Look at it carefully." As they watched, the baby's crying subsided and he turned his head toward them. Instead of the terror they expected, the infant's dark eyes showed only curiosity. He reached out with one tiny hand, making soft cooing sounds. "It shows no fear," Korath rumbled, his deep voice echoing off the mountain walls. "Even our own young cower when they first see an elder." The baby began to cry again, and the sound cut through the dragons like a blade. It was not the shriek of prey or the challenge of arrival. It was the call of the helpless for aid, the same sound that triggered protective instincts in dragons for their own young. Valara made the decision that would change everything. With infinite care, she lowered her great head and gently lifted the human infant in her jaws, holding him as carefully as she would one of her own precious eggs. The baby immediately stopped crying and reached out to touch her scales with wonder in his eyes. "What are you doing?" Gareth demanded. "What honor requires," Valara replied. "The hatchling was placed in our territory by those who could no longer care for it. By the ancient laws, he is now under our protection." Korath studied his mate's actions and slowly nodded his massive head. "The old ways are clear. We do not harm the defenseless regardless of species. But can such a creature even survive in our domain?" As if in answer, Baby Tay laughed, a sound like tiny bells that none of the dragons had ever heard before. He had no fear of their massive forms, no understanding that he was different from them. To him they were simply the large beings who had answered his cries for help. The dragons looked at each other, an entire conversation passing between them in an instant. They were about to undertake something unprecedented in their long history, but their honor demanded nothing less. 3 years had passed since the night Tay arrived in the dragon lair, and the mountain community had adapted in ways none of them had anticipated. The human child, now walking and babbling in a mixture of human words and dragon concepts, had become an integral part of their ancient society. Valara had carved out a special chamber in their lair, lined with soft materials and heated by thermal vents to keep the warm-blooded child comfortable. She had learned to hunt smaller prey to provide the meat and plants that Tay's digestive system required, so different from the dragon's diet of large game and mineral deposits. "Mama Vel," Tay called out as he toddled toward her, his small arms outstretched. The dragons had been amazed at how quickly he learned to walk upright on just 2 limbs, a feat that seemed impossible yet natural to him. What fascinated them most was his tool use. While dragon hatchlings relied on natural abilities, claws, teeth, and fire, Tay instinctively grabbed objects to extend his reach. He used sticks to retrieve items, stacked stones to climb higher, and fashioned crude implements from whatever materials he found. "Watch this," Gareth said to the other young dragons as they gathered for the daily lessons. Korath had been teaching all the younglings about thermal currents and hunting patterns, but Tay had found his own way to participate. The human child had discovered that he could use polished metal fragments to reflect sunlight and create bright spots of light on the cave walls. While the dragon young learned to navigate by instinct and magnetic fields, Tay was learning to create simple maps by arranging stones in patterns that represented the mountain paths. "He thinks differently than we do," observed Thane, another elder dragon. "Where we see the mountain as one entity, he breaks it down into smaller parts, then puts them back together in his mind." Valara watched with pride as Tay showed a group of dragon hatchlings how to use a lever to move a stone that was too heavy for any of them to lift directly. The young dragons were twice his size but had never considered using the environment itself as a tool. "Papa Kor," Tay said, running to Korath as the great dragon returned from a hunting flight. "Look what I made." The child held up a crude necklace made from polished pebbles and twisted plant fibers. By dragon standards, it was utterly useless, providing no protection or practical benefit, yet Korath found himself deeply moved by the gift, recognizing it as something purely aesthetic, created for no purpose other than to bring joy. "It is beautiful, little flame," Korath rumbled, lowering his great head so Tay could place the tiny necklace around his massive neck. The other dragons had begun to notice how Tay's presence changed their community. Where they had once been solitary except for mating and child-rearing, they now found themselves gathering more often, drawn by the child's infectious laughter and endless curiosity. He asked questions constantly, questions that the dragons had never thought to ask. Why did the wind change direction at sunset? What made some stones sparkle while others did not? Could they fly higher than the clouds? His endless why became a word that the entire Lair learned to understand. But perhaps most remarkably, Tay seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of dragon emotions that even impressed the empathic creatures themselves. When old Zoran was mourning the loss of his mate, it was Tay who climbed onto the grieving dragon's head and simply sat there, offering wordless comfort that somehow reached through centuries of stoic tradition. As Tay grew, so did the dragon's understanding that they were not just raising a human child, they were witnessing the emergence of something that would bridge two worlds in ways neither species had ever imagined. Possible the child who had been cast into their domain as a last desperate hope was becoming something unprecedented. A human raised by dragons carrying the wisdom of both species within his growing mind. By his 8th year, Tay had grown into a quick, intelligent boy whose human nature was becoming increasingly apparent to the dragon community. While the dragon young of his generation were learning to breathe fire and achieve their first sustained flights, Tay was developing capabilities that left his adoptive family both amazed and concerned. "I can make fire too," Tay announced one morning, showing Korath a cleverly constructed apparatus made from focused crystal lenses and tinder. The concentrated sunlight created a small but steady flame that he could control and direct. "That is not dragon fire, little flame," Korath explained gently. "Our fire comes from within, from the chemical reactions in our bodies. But mine is better," Tay said with the confidence of childhood. "I can make it burn different colors by adding different minerals, and I can make it start even when it's raining." The dragons exchanged glances. The boy was right, and that realization was both wonderful and troubling. Elder Nira, the wisest of their community, watched as Tay demonstrated his latest invention, a pulley system that allowed him to lift objects nearly as heavy as what a young dragon could manage with brute strength. "He does not simply adapt to our world," she observed. "He reshapes it to suit his needs." This was becoming a pattern. When the dragon youth learned to hunt by developing their natural predatory instincts, Tay created traps and snares that could catch prey without requiring him to chase it down. When they navigated by reading magnetic fields and air currents, he drew detailed maps and crafted a primitive compass. The most significant difference, however, was in how he related to other species. The dragons were apex predators, commanding respect and fear from all other creatures on Valdris. But Tay had begun befriending the small mammals and birds that nested in the lower reaches of the mountain. "He speaks to the prey animals," young Ryok reported with bewilderment, "and they respond to him as if he were one of them." Indeed, Tay had learned to communicate with various creatures through a combination of mimicked sounds, gestures, and an intuitive understanding of their body language. He had even trained a family of mountain foxes to help him gather specific plants and minerals. "This is not natural," Gareth complained during a gathering of the elders. "A predator should not consort with prey. It violates the natural order." "Perhaps," Korath replied thoughtfully, "or perhaps humans simply have a different understanding of what the natural order should be." The tension came to a head when a group of wounded sky deer took shelter in the lower caves during a storm. The dragon's instinct was to hunt them, as was their right and nature. But Tay stood between the predators and their prey, his small form dwarfed by the massive dragons but his determination absolute. "They're hurt and scared," he said firmly. "They need help, not hunting." "This is foolishness," Gareth rumbled. "You cannot protect every weak creature. It is not the way of the strong." "Then maybe the way of the strong is wrong," Tay shot back, his young voice carrying a conviction that surprised everyone, including himself. The cave fell silent. For the dragons, strength and dominance were fundamental truths, the basis of their entire worldview. Yet here was their adopted child, raised in their traditions, challenging concepts they had never thought to question. Valara settled the immediate dispute by declaring that the deer could shelter until the storm passed. But the larger questions Ty had raised lingered in the minds of every dragon present. That night, as Ty slept curled against Valara's warm flank, the dragons held council. "He grows more human each day," Nira observed. "And perhaps that is not entirely a blessing." "He thinks as they do," Thane agreed. "Always questioning, always changing things. It is their nature to be dissatisfied with the world as it is." "And yet," Korath said slowly, "look what his dissatisfaction has brought us. Tools that make our lives easier. New ways of seeing old problems. Joy in simple things we had forgotten to notice." The debate would continue for many nights, but one thing was becoming clear. Tay was not becoming a human-shaped dragon. He was becoming something entirely new. A bridge between species that carried the best qualities of both worlds. Whether that would prove to be salvation or catastrophe remained to be seen. At 12 years old, Tay had grown tall and lean, his human frame adapted to mountain life but still utterly distinct from his dragon family. His workshop, carved into a natural alcove of the Lair, had become a wonder of primitive engineering filled with devices that no dragon could have conceived. The crisis began when scouts reported movement in the valley below. Ships bearing the insignia of the hegemony, the galactic empire that had claimed dominion over this sector, had landed near the human settlement. The dragons watched from their heights as soldiers in powered armor began rounding up the human colonists. "They're taking them away," Tay said, his voice tight with emotion as he peered through the optical device he had constructed to magnify distant objects. "That is the way of conquest," Korath replied, though his tone was gentler than usual. "The strong take what they will from the weak." "It is an old story." "But those are my people," Tay protested. "They're humans, like me." "You are not like them," Valara said firmly. "You are ours, raised in our ways, protected by our strength." For the first time in his life, Tay felt the full weight of being caught between two worlds. He loved his dragon family with all his heart, but watching humans being herded like cattle sparked something deep within him that had been dormant until now. That night, he made a decision that would shock the entire Lair. Using rope and climbing gear he had crafted himself, Tay descended the mountain under cover of darkness. He made his way to the human camp, moving with stealth that his dragon upbringing had taught him. What he found there broke his heart. The humans were imprisoned in energy cages, their faces hollow with despair. Children cried for parents who had been taken elsewhere. The elderly sat in silent resignation, but Tay also saw something the dragons had missed. These weren't just weak victims waiting for rescue. He watched as the humans organized themselves, sharing resources, comforting the frightened, and quietly planning resistance with nothing but whispered words and meaningful glances. An old woman named Bo noticed him first. "You're human," she whispered in amazement. "But how are you free?" "I live with the dragons," Tay whispered back. "I can help you." Over the next several nights, Tay became an invisible lifeline between the imprisoned humans and the outside world. He brought them food, medicine, and tools small enough to be hidden. More importantly, he brought them hope. He learned their names: Kai the engineer, Yun the teacher, Yuk the farmer, Su the medic. Each had skills that the hegemony wanted to exploit, but also dreams and connections that made them more than just resources to be harvested. "You remind me of my grandson," Bo told him during one visit. "The same stubborn hope, the same refusal to accept that things have to be the way they are." When the dragons discovered his nighttime excursions, the confrontation was explosive. "You risk everything we have built," Gareth roared. "If the hegemony discovers our involvement, they will bring war to our mountain." "You think like prey," Tay shot back, his human passion blazing. "Always hiding, always afraid. These people need help and we have the power to give it." "We have the power to survive," Korath corrected grimly, "which we have done for millennia by not interfering in the affairs of other species." "Then maybe it's time to start," Tay declared. "You taught me about honor, about protecting the helpless. How is this different?" The argument revealed the fundamental difference between human and dragon nature. Dragons thought in terms of centuries, of survival and stability. Humans thought in terms of what was right, regardless of the cost. That difference came to a head when Tay announced his most audacious plan yet. "I'm going to free them. All of them." "Impossible," Nira said flatly. "The hegemony has weapons that could destroy this entire mountain. You cannot fight an empire." "Watch me," Tay replied with quiet determination. "You raised me to be strong. You raised me to use my mind. Now I'm going to use both to save my people." As he began outlining his plan, the dragons realized they were seeing something they had never encountered before. The human spirit in its full glory, refusing to bow to impossible odds, creating hope where none should exist. Whether they would support him or try to stop him would determine not just the fate of the human prisoners, but the future relationship between their species. The plan Tay presented to the dragons was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Using detailed reconnaissance and his understanding of both human ingenuity and dragon capabilities, he had devised a rescue operation that could work, if everything went perfectly. "The hegemony's power comes from their technology," Tay explained, spreading out the detailed maps and diagrams he had created. "But technology has weaknesses. Their energy shields protect against direct assault but not against indirect attacks. Their sensors detect large threats but not small ones." He pointed to key positions on his hand-drawn schematic of the enemy camp. "We use what makes us different. Humans adapt and improvise. Dragons have raw power and mobility. Together, we can do what neither could accomplish alone." The dragons listened with growing amazement as Tay outlined how they could disable the enemy's communications array, overload their power grid, and create chaos that would allow the prisoners to escape. Each phase of the plan relied on precise coordination between human innovation and dragon strength. "You want us to carry these devices?" Gareth asked, examining the electromagnetic pulse generators Tay had constructed from salvaged components. "Not carry. Deploy them. You can fly higher than their sensors can track at night. Drop them at precise coordinates, then disappear before they know what hit them." Valara studied the escape routes Tay had mapped. These paths would require the humans to travel through territories controlled by predators. "That's where the Alliance comes in," Tay said with a grin. "I've been talking to the local wildlife. They're not happy about the hegemony's presence either. Those soldiers have been poisoning water sources and destroying habitats." The dragons exchanged glances. Only a human would think to negotiate with prey animals as equals. Elder Nira was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "This plan requires us to reveal ourselves to the galaxy. Once we act against the hegemony, there will be no hiding in our mountains." "Then we don't hide," Tay said simply. "We stand up and show them what we're capable of when we work together." The debate that followed raged for 3 days. The elder dragons argued for caution, for the safety that isolation had always provided. The younger dragons, inspired by Tay's vision, pushed for action. Finally, Korath made the decision that would change everything. "The boy is right. We have hidden in these mountains for too long, watching injustice unfold while telling ourselves it is not our concern. Perhaps it is time to remember that with great power comes great responsibility." The operation began at midnight under a new moon. Tay coordinated from his position overlooking the camp while dragons circled high above, invisible against the star-filled sky. His makeshift communication devices, built from components scavenged over years of careful collection, linked the various teams together. Phase 1 went perfectly. The EMP devices disabled the camp's power grid and communications array simultaneously. Emergency lighting flickered on, but the hegemony soldiers found themselves cut off from their command structure and operating on backup power. Phase 2 required precision timing. While the dragons created diversions on the camp's perimeter, drawing guards away from key positions, Tay infiltrated the prisoner compound, using routes he had memorized during his reconnaissance. "Missions. This way," he whispered to the startled humans as he unlocked their energy cages using a device that exploited a vulnerability he had discovered in the hegemony's security systems. But the most crucial moment came when alarms began blaring and hegemony reinforcements arrived by air. Heavy assault shuttles descended on the camp, their weapons capable of incinerating everything within miles. That was when the true power of the Human-Dragon Alliance revealed itself. The dragons, no longer hiding their presence, rose from their mountain lairs in a display of coordinated might that took the breath away from everyone who witnessed it. But they didn't attack with tooth and claw as the soldiers expected. Instead, they executed Tay's tactical plan with surgical precision. Korath used his flame breath to superheat the shuttle's metal hulls, while Valara generated powerful electromagnetic fields that disrupted their navigation systems. Other dragons created wind shears that made controlled flight impossible. "Impossible," breathed the hegemony commander, as his forces found themselves outmaneuvered by creatures he had dismissed as mere animals, coordinated by a boy who shouldn't have been able to understand advanced military tactics. As the last of the prisoners reached safety, following escape routes that wound through terrain only someone raised by mountain dwellers could have mapped, Tay stood on a ledge overlooking the chaos below. Beside him, Korath landed with thunderous impact. "Is this what humans call victory?" the great dragon asked. "No," Tay replied, watching the hegemony forces retreat in confusion and defeat. "This is what humans call the beginning." 6 months after the liberation of the human prisoners, the mountain that had once hidden a reclusive dragon community had become the headquarters of the most unlikely alliance in galactic history. The sight that greeted visitors was one that would have been impossible to imagine just a year before. Human engineers worked alongside dragons to construct buildings that blended human innovation with dragon architectural principles. Children, both human and young dragons, played together in courtyards designed for both species. The air hummed with activity as two cultures that had evolved separately learned to build something entirely new together. Tay, now 13 and bearing the informal title of ambassador, stood in the great hall addressing a gathering that included not just dragons and humans, but representatives from dozens of species across the sector. Word of the successful resistance against the hegemony had spread, inspiring hope in worlds that had forgotten what freedom looked like. They said it was impossible, Tay told the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had made the impossible routine. That different species couldn't truly work together, that power would always corrupt, that the strong would always dominate the weak. Behind him, a massive display showed the fruits of human-dragon cooperation, new technologies that neither species could have developed alone, defensive systems that made their world virtually impregnable. Most importantly, a social structure that protected the rights of all while honoring the strengths of each. "We proved them wrong," Tay continued, "not by being perfect, but by being willing to see the value in differences instead of fearing them." In the audience, Bo the Elder smiled as she watched the boy she had met in a prison cage address the galaxy as an equal. Beside her sat Korath, the ancient dragon who had learned that wisdom sometimes came from the youngest voices. "The hegemony wants us to believe that peace can only come through dominance," Tay said, "but we've shown them something better. Peace through partnership, strength through diversity, progress through cooperation." The alliance had not been without its challenges. Cultural misunderstandings, conflicting instincts, and the simple difficulty of coordinating between species with vastly different lifespans and perspectives had created friction that required constant attention and compromise, but each challenge overcome had made them stronger. When human impatience clashed with dragon deliberation, they learned to balance immediate action with long-term planning. When dragon pride conflicted with human egalitarianism, they developed leadership structures that honored both hierarchy and democracy. Engineer Key had worked with dragon metallurgists to create alloys stronger than anything either species had produced independently. Teacher Yoon had established schools where human children learned dragon wisdom, while young dragons discovered human creativity. Farmer Hayuk had developed agricultural techniques that fed both species while actually improving the mountain ecosystem. The hegemony sent a fleet, reported Sue, who had become the Alliance's chief medical officer and intelligence coordinator. 50 ships expecting to find scattered refugees and primitive natives. What they found instead, Tay said with a grin that would have been familiar to anyone who had known him as a small child, was a unified defense force that sent them running back to their core worlds to report that this sector is now under the protection of the Dragon-Human Alliance. The applause that followed shook the mountain, but Tay's thoughts turned to the broader implications of what they had accomplished. Other worlds were already requesting assistance in establishing their own multi-species alliances. The rigid hierarchies that had dominated galactic politics for millennia were beginning to crack under the pressure of a new model that actually worked. That evening, as the Great Hall emptied and the delegates returned to their quarters, Tay found himself on the same ledge where Korath had first carried him as an infant. The ancient dragon joined him, their comfortable silence speaking of years of shared understanding. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if my parents hadn't sent me here?" Tay asked. "Often," Korath admitted, "but I think perhaps the universe has a way of bringing together what needs to be united. You were meant to bridge our worlds, little flame. The question is what bridge you will build next." Tay looked out over the valley where humans and dragons worked side by side under the light of Valdris's crimson moons. Ships from a dozen worlds dotted the landing fields, bringing delegations eager to learn from their example. "Whatever comes next," he said finally, "we'll face it together. That's what humans do best. We adapt, we overcome, and we bring others along with us." In the distance, a group of human children were teaching young dragons to play a game that required both flight and tool use, creating rules that accommodated both species while challenging them to think in new ways. It was a perfect metaphor for what the Alliance had become. Not human or dragon, but something entirely new and infinitely more powerful than the sum of its parts. The boy who had been hurled into a dragon's lair as a desperate last hope had become the bridge between worlds, proving that sometimes the most impossible dreams are simply waiting for someone brave enough to make them real.